Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today to learn about making sense of the alphabet soup of pricing policies. I'm excited for us to get started. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Eugene Zelek from Taft Law. Gene, thank you for spending time with us today to help us understand more about pricing policies and the best ways to enforce against them. I'll pass things over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry. There we go. Sorry for the technical difficulties. There you can see what we look like. Not that that's terribly important, but obviously Michelle is far better looking than I am, which is par for the course. We are indeed going to talk about making sense out of the alphabet soup of pricing policies. And as many of you know, there's lots of acronyms floating around and lots of confusion. And hopefully we can cut through all of that because it turns out it's really not that bad and it's really not that hard. Now, to understand where these things come from, before we get into the meat of the discussion, the reason that pricing policies are used is to deal with resale price erosion, which is caused by corrosive channel conflict. And what I mean by that is typically, and certainly the internet has put this on hyperdrive, anytime you've got channel members, whether they're retailers, distributors, dealers, whatever, with very different cost structures and overhead structures, it is possible that some can undercut others in terms of their resale prices. And that causes some serious problems. If it gets bad enough, it really becomes corrosive. And it turns out there simply are some people who can't afford to carry the product or refuse to carry the product. And indeed, what we often see is traditional resellers complaining and placing great pressure on manufacturers. They want better buy prices to maintain their margins because they simply can't compete with those that are throwing lower prices out there. They threaten to drop brands with insufficient margin. And then they also, and these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, they emphasize their higher margin private label products or other brands that give them better margins. By the same token, you've got online resellers that are, of course, becoming increasingly more powerful. And it's pretty much their way or the highway. Those of you that have dealt with Amazon know exactly what I'm talking about, particularly as Amazon dictates all kinds of things. And it really is Amazon's way or the highway. Walmart is almost as bad, and we've had issues with Chewy and many others in this regard. There's something else going on that often is not addressed, and we call it the stakes. And what we mean by this, looking at this, this graphic, in this particular hypothetical brand, if all the sales were made, and by sales I mean at the retail level or at the end user level, if all the sales were made at the suggested resale price, this brand would be worth $90 million a year. But not all sales are made at that price. Instead, there's some discount that takes place, reducing the average resale price so that the aggregate sales to the end user are $63 million. That's the size of the pie. That's the total value within the channel. And then, of course, depending on what the manufacturer, in this example, there's only one reseller. So we're assuming that the manufacturer sells directly to the retailer or distributor or dealer or whatever. So in this example, depending on what the acquisition price is, which of course is set by the manufacturer, that determines what we call the cut or the split of this value. The bottom line is that if the manufacturer can raise the average resale price, the pie is simply bigger. And that puts more money in its pocket. That can put more money in the pocket of the reseller. And it also can cause, particularly if there's more money on the table, it can cause the manufacturer to revisit the cut and say, is this really equitable? So for example, a few years ago, we did a pricing policy for a client. It was very successful, to the point that they raised the average price per unit by $5. That is, they raised the acquisition price of the resellers. And that, of course, that increment fell right to the bottom line. Now, how could they do that? They could do that because once they stabilized the resale price, they realized that the dealers, in this case, in the view of the manufacturer, were getting too much margin. So they reallocated it and they took more themselves. So that's another advantage to doing this kind of thing. there's a tendency to focus, go right to the bottom language here in green, pricing programs, agreement, and unilateral policies. But there really are a variety of ways to address resale price erosion. And we will focus on the ones in green because that's the topic of our discussion. But I think this is something else that is often lost. It is possible to selectively raise buy prices by channel. We have some clients that are able to justify higher prices to internet-only resellers versus brick and mortar resellers. And there are some concerns, one of them under the laws of the Robinson-Patman Act, but there are ways to deal with that. We've got other clients that do channel or reseller differentiation by changing the product, different names for different channels, different weights or sizes, different counts. So the 200 count bottle is available at brick and mortar, but only the 100 count bottle is available at online or some such thing. Another alternative is to silo products. We have one particular client that comes to mind that had what I call BAMO, bricks and mortar only. So some of its products simply could not be sold online, and there were restrictions placed on resellers. These could only be shown or sold within the store. Another alternative is direct dealing. And by direct dealing, this is where the manufacturer sells directly to the end user and controls the price. And there are ways, and this certainly does not apply to all industries or all businesses, but there are ways where the manufacturer makes the sale, but it's fulfilled through resellers. And if anybody would like to hear about that in more detail, we can dig into it. Otherwise, we'll move on. Another alternative, it's really kind of old-fashioned, is to have price discussions. And we as an example, we did have a client do this. It hired McKinsey, which is a client of ours. McKinsey did a very fancy elasticity study. And the manufacturer went to dealers and said, see, if you raise your prices, you're really not going to lose volume. And there's plenty of proof that that would be the case. And of course, the dealer said, that's nice, and it may even be true, but if I raise my prices and the guy across the street doesn't, I'm dead. So we wound up going with a pricing policy. But it is possible to have price discussions where you urge, you can't threaten, but you can urge the resellers to take prices up. And again, a number of these things are certainly not mutually exclusive. The final one before we get into pricing programs is to simply call discounters. To my knowledge, Rolex does not have any kind of formal pricing policy or whatever. But if it finds a jeweler discounting Rolex watches, it simply stops doing business with it. And the jeweler comes back and says, what did I do? What did I do? And the Rolex looks at him and says, you know, and that's it. They're dead, they're history. So that's another alternative. But far more common, especially these days, are pricing programs. And there are really two ways to do them, by agreement or by unilateral policies. So what's the difference? An agreement requires approval from the other side to implement or change. I mean, by definition, you have to go out and get everybody to agree what you want to do. And unless your agreement allows it, every time you make a change, you've got to get everybody to agree. If that's your scenario, what that means is every time you make a change, any one reseller has veto power, because if they don't agree, you can't do it with respect to them, and maybe your whole program falls apart. Far better are unilateral policies. And unilateral policies are effectively announcements. So you just announce it. This is our policy. And they work on kind of an interesting fiction. And the fiction is, hey, you don't have to follow the policy if you don't want to. But if you choose not to, bad things happen to you. Those of you that have heard me speak before, you may have heard me use one of my favorite examples. So if, let's say you have a teenage daughter and you tell her that her curfew is midnight on the weekend. And you tell her, look, your curfew is midnight. If you want to come in later, perfectly okay. You can absolutely do that. However, bad things will happen to you. So if you come in after midnight, you can do that, but you're grounded till you're 35. So this is the same kind of thing with these unilateral policies. They're announcements where in theory, they don't have to be followed. There's no requirement to be followed. But if a reseller refuses to follow the policy, bad things happen to it. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But the advantage of unilateral policies is they're announcements that can be adopted or changed anytime. So you don't need agreement, because after all, they're not agreements. You change them as you go. So they provide a whole lot more flexibility, and therefore they're very attractive. There's some other advantages too, and we'll come to those in a minute. Now, One of the issues that we run across all the time in this area is everybody calls all pricing policies MAP, and that's not the case. MAP is one alternative out of many, and we're going to get into that. So don't fall into the trap. Everything is not MAP. MAP officially stands for minimum advertised price, and we'll come to the variations in a second. So it's important to note everything is not MAP. So I mentioned this area really isn't that hard, and it isn't, notwithstanding all the acronyms. There really are two broad types of minimum price programs. The first is minimum resale or retail price. Both get you to MRP. And this covers all offers that are made and the actual selling price. Now, typically, the offer price and the selling price are the same. So in an MRP program, you specify a minimum price that applies to all offers plus the actual selling price. In contrast is MAP, minimum advertised price programs, that cover some offers, but never the actual selling price. So what do I mean by that? To put it in context, starting with MAP, so we'll go backwards. With MAP, in the online context, you can cover the product page and you can cover the in the cart price, but not the checkout price. At brick and mortar, MAP covers anything outside the store, newspaper advertising, internet advertising, whatever, but nothing in the store. Flyers handed out at the door, displays, price tags, whatever. In contrast, MRP programs cover everything. All offers inside the store and outside the store, all offers online, regardless of where they appear, plus the actual selling price. Now, the reality is, this is another issue that comes up. People say, well, if you're going to do an MRP program, and of the, we've easily done 400 or 500 pricing policies over the last 30 years. And they're split about half and half between MRP and MAP or variations. How do you monitor MRP? And what we find is it's monitored the same way as MAP. Most companies focus on monitoring online offer prices. And after all, the only way you see the actual selling price is to do a mystery shop. So mystery shops are expensive and time consuming, but those will take place if you smell a rat and really want to see what the actual selling price is. Otherwise, you monitor the same way you do MAP. Now, one of the other things that comes up, and it also is confusing, is UPP. So where does UPP fit in? UPP stands for Unilateral Pricing Policy, and it's meant to be identical to what we call MRP, but we don't like it. We don't like it because both MRP and MAP are usually unilateral pricing policies. So if I talk about unilateral pricing policy, which am I referring to? Is it MAP or is it MRP? It's far better to make the distinction, and that's why we use only MRP and MAP. But you still see UPP floating around, and it generally means an MRP policy, but it is confusing. So since what we're all about here today is trying to cut through the confusion, I'd say stay away from UPP, focus on MRP or MAP, because it makes a cleaner distinction. Now, another issue that comes up in this area is some people believe, well, you can't have a unilateral MAP policy. And that's just dead wrong. But I think what it comes out of is the evolution in this area. So originally, there were MAP agreements between suppliers and resellers, where the reseller said, look, in return for my ad being funded in whole or part or getting some other promotional goodies, I agree I'm not going to advertise below MAP. If the reseller did not follow through on its agreement and did indeed go below MAP, the only penalty was it lost the funds for that offending ad. But there was a big gap in this approach, and the big gap is a reseller using its own funds was exempt from those agreements. So to give you a real life example, Nintendo historically has used a sort of an old-fashioned MAP policy that only covers funds that come from Nintendo. So if Walmart wanted to run a special on Nintendo products at a very low price, as long as Walmart was paying for the ad or the roto or whatever it was, Nintendo had nothing to say about it. So there's nothing wrong, and we'll talk about the legal aspects of this, but there really is nothing wrong with using MAP agreements in this fashion, as long as you understand the limitation typically and the penalties. Well, because of those limitations, as time went on, the next generation seemed to be, instead of having MAP agreements, we're going to have MAP policies. But they essentially were the same thing. They only applied to funds and the loss of funds for offending ads. And then as more time went on, particularly as the internet grew and internet selling grew, and largely driven by the transparency of pricing on the internet, people who were interested in MAP said, wait a minute, there are too many holes in this. We need to cover everybody, all advertising or all offers, not just advertising. And it shouldn't matter who pays. So we want to cover all offer prices, regardless of who pays. So what's happened is this area has evolved into using unilateral policies, which were sort of out there before, but adopting a penalty structure that's more like an MRP policy. And we'll come to that in a bit. So you do have unilateral MAP policies. They look a lot like MRP policies. It's just they differ in coverage, but the penalties are often very, very similar. And again, we'll come to that. So again, this is sort of where this came out of, and we'll talk more about history in a minute. But this may explain why some people believe you can't have unilateral MAP policies, because they're still stuck on this notion of agreements, and that's long in the rearview mirror because they simply didn't go far enough. Oops, sorry about that. What about other acronyms in this area? So there are a variety of variations on MAP. One we see all the time is called IMAP. So what an IMAP policy is a manufacturer may say, you know what, I really don't care about pricing at bricks and mortar. What I'm really concerned about is the visibility of pricing on the internet. So I'm going to do an IMAP. So the bricks and mortar people, no restrictions on them. They want to advertise in rotos, or they want to advertise in newspapers, on TV or whatever, no restrictions at all. I'm just going to be concerned about internet advertising. Emap is a variation on that, and it's broader. We prefer Emap because when clients come to us and they say we're really only concerned about electronic minimum advertised price, meaning not only the internet, but we're also concerned about people offering prices on social media or anything else that's electronic. So Emap to us, that's why we prefer it, is simply broader, but it covers all things electronic. But it is MAP, meaning it's only focused on the offer prices, not on the actual selling prices. Similarly, there are variations on MRP. One that comes up all the time is MSRP. That stands for Manufacturer's Suggested Resale Price, or Retail Price. This is just that, it's a suggestion. There's usually no teeth behind this. What it really is for those of you that have bought new cars, it's the sticker price that's on the car. Or if you buy a bag of Frito-Lay potato chips, those are pre-priced up in the right-hand corner. But interestingly, and this illustrates the point, you have resellers like Walmart that don't follow that. They sell substantially below the price that's on there. Interestingly, we have a client in the women's apparel area that has equated MSRP with MRP, meaning that whatever how the garments are tagged with something that says MSRP, retailers are required under the MRP policy, they can't go below the MSRP price. So they equated them. But generally, it's just a suggestion and there's no teeth to it. A variation on that theme is something called SRP, which is suggested resale price or retail price. It gets you to the same place. It's just a suggestion. There's no teeth. In some industries, we don't see it so much in consumer stuff, but particularly in industrial, the suggested resale price is just it's a fictitious number. It's just out there as sort of a benchmark. Now, something that does have teeth in the MRP area would be EMRP, which again is electronic minimum resale price. So here it's an MRP policy, but it only applies to all things electronic. Again, we don't care about bricks and mortar. So consistent with what we talked about, essentially only two variations or two broad variations, MAP and MRP. But then we've done some hybrid programs. We'll talk more about those later. But some additional variations are, we have indeed done a single policy that incorporates both MAP and MRP. And you say, now, wait a minute. If you think about it, MAP only covers the offer price. MRP covers the selling price. So by definition, MAP or MRP includes the offer price and the selling price. So it incorporates a MAP concept. That's absolutely true. But in this case, we had a client that said, look, I've got some products. This is a manufacturer of electronic products. I've got some products that are the crown jewels, and I want them covered by MRP. And I've got other products where I don't mind some variation in the actual selling price, and I want those covered by MAP. So we incorporated both of those into the same policy with obviously a MAP MRP division. But the thought was when a product was new and red hot, it would be MRP. As it got a little longer in the tooth, particularly in the electronic area where there's lots of innovation, it would move over to MAP and then maybe eventually just drop off altogether. There would be no control on the price. But you can do that. You can do one policy that covers both if you want. Another thing that's come up, it's pretty rare, but we're seeing a little bit more of it, particularly with some people, like during the pandemic, engaging in price gouging, that is charging really, really high prices. And we're talking about resellers here, is to set a maximum price. So we do have some clients that have asked about setting a maximum price, and that is certainly doable. We don't see it very often, but it's absolutely doable. Something that we've seen some of coming out of the pandemic is setting a price range. So we're going to dictate a maximum price, but we're also going to dictate a minimum price. And you, reseller, have to stay within that range. So you could, by the way, if you're doing a max price or a min max, you can do either MRP or MAP with it. It's really up to you. So we see some of those kinds of variations. I mean, one of the underlying currents here is there's no such thing as one size fits all. We usually take great pains in talking to clients to find out exactly what their issues are and then meet it with a policy that does just that. We're not wedded to MAP, we're not wedded to MRP, and we certainly are advocates of using some of the other tools if it helps get us to the right place. I mentioned hybrid forms. Really not a it's not altogether different than MAP or MRP, but we've had some clients that say, look, I'm going to set an MRP price, but I'm also going to have a promo MRP price. Now, what does that mean? That means on the list of MRP products, I have my MRP price, but I may on some of those products may also have a promo MRP price that I regulate. I may say, look, 3 times a year, you can go down to promo MRP for no longer than a week at a time, and so on and so forth. So you can incorporate both of those concepts where you automatically build in some flex. We've done the same with MAP too, so that's doable. The other thing we've seen is clients coming back to us and saying, you know what, I want MRPs or MAPs that vary. So I want one MRP or MAP for online, and I want a different one for brick and mortar. Can you do that? Absolutely. Now, interestingly, we've had situations where you have a brick and mortar reseller that has one of these MRPs or MAPs, and let's assume there's a different one for online, and it winds up crossing over, meaning that if it takes its roto, its hard copy roto, but puts it online, it now is subject to the online MRP or MAP because it's online, even though it is the hard copy brick and mortar, the hard copy brick and mortar version. Another takeaway from this is if you do an EMRP or you do an Emap or IMAP, for example, even though that doesn't apply to brick and mortar people, if they take any of their hard copy promotional material and put it online, they're now subject to it. Now, it doesn't happen to happen that way, but it will unless you accept that out. Another reason to vary the MRPs and the MAPs is by stage of the buy process. We have some clients, I can think of one in the pet food area, that wanted a different MAP on the product page, a lower MAP or allowed a lower MAP for the in the cart price. And that's just the way they wanted to do it. Can you do that? Absolutely. And then one of the more intriguing ones was one of our clients that said, hey, I'm going to go to all my resellers. This is actually a consumer product. So go to my retailers. And I'm going to say, you have to tell me whether you want to be EDLP, everyday low price, or high-low. For those of you unfamiliar with these terms, an EDLP seller is Walmart. everyday low price. Few specials, you always run at a low price. High-low would be somebody like Publix, supermarkets, or Safeway, or Kroger, where their everyday price is fairly high, but then they will do deep discounts occasionally for promotional purposes. So the manufacturer went to the retailers and said, you have to tell me whether you want to be EDLP or high-low. And by the way, if you don't tell me by a certain date, I'm going to put you in one box or another. Now, what was the significance of that? In the case of the EDLP people, their minimum price, their everyday minimum price was, let's call it $12.99. In the case of those with high-low, their everyday minimum price was $14.99. But the high-low people twice per year could go down to $11.99 or some such number. But that was the idea. So this again is another example of the customization that can take place. Hopefully not adding to the confusion, but creating more options that are styled to deal with specific problems. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so why? 2 steps here. There we go. Sorry about that. I have a very sensitive mouse. So what are the legal standards for pricing programs? Pricing agreements first. Remember, that's one of the 2 alternatives. You do this by agreement or by policy. In the MAP area, it's covered by something called the rule of reason at the federal or state level. The rule of reason is a very liberal standard. I should say very manufacturer favorable standard. It says we're going to presume whatever you're doing is lawful until it can be shown on balance to be unreasonably anti-competitive. What that gobbledygook really means is it's very hard for a plaintiff challenging a practice to win a rule of reason case. And that means it's relatively low risk on the part of the manufacturer, and you get a lot of running room. So MAP agreements are covered by the rule of reason at the federal and state levels. MRP, most states are the rule of reason, which is the same thing at the federal level. This is for MRP agreements now. But 5 states have taken the position that an agreement on minimum resale or retail price is always illegal or unenforceable. And those 5 states are New York, California, Illinois, Michigan, and Maryland. If you're in the contact lens business, there's one other state. Utah bans both agreements or policies dealing with resale price in the contact lens area only. So they're really kind of an outlier. And it came out of some litigation that is in the process of being settled out, but is still ongoing. So pricing agreements, if you're doing MAP, you can do it by agreement. MRP, you can do by agreement in a bunch of states and at the federal level, but 5 states, it's a big no-no. So what does that really mean? If you're going to do MRP, you've got to do it as unilateral policy. Now, the magic to a policy is it's not covered by the price fixing laws. So there's no rule of reason. It's simply outside the law in a positive sense. And because of, one, the flexibility afforded by policies, as I mentioned before, you don't need to get agreement. You can just change them anytime you feel like it. Plus, the fact they're not covered by the price fixing laws means they're the first choice for MAP or MRP programs. So you want to do this by unilateral policy. That's the magic. And so it's very favorable to do it this way. And all 50 states say unilateral policies, not a problem. And that's why we do it. Now, why is there different treatment for policies? Without boring you to death with the law, probably the most applicable is Section 1 of the Sherman Act, which is the primary U.S. antitrust statute. And it says, it's literally, I left out a few words, but literally these few words: every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade is hereby declared to be illegal. The magic language is what's in red: contract, combination, or conspiracy. The bottom line is the price fixing laws only apply where there are agreements. No agreement, no application. That's the bottom line. And that's the magic in all this. And all 50 states have said, hey, we agree. If it's a unilateral policy, it's not covered. Even California, which is probably one of the toughest states in this area and clearly bans resale price agreements, has said, hey, unilateral policies, no issue. Okay. What about the rest of North America? In both Canada or Mexico, MAP or MRP covered by the rule of reason. And it doesn't matter whether there are agreements or policies, you get the same treatment. So rule of reason, very favorable. Canada up until 2009 made anything dealing with resale price, even MAP policies that at least imply a minimum resale price. MAP policies or MRP were criminally illegal in Canada. In 2009, Canada amended its Competition Act to adopt what essentially is the rule of reason. And there have been no cases since. So in the, 13 years since, or almost 13 years since, absolutely no cases. So a lot of running room in Canada. Mexico, rule of reason, but not many cases at all, are rarely enforced. And interestingly, this issue has come up just recently, but many of our clients are concerned about Canada and the US, probably because of the volume of trade. They tend to be less concerned about Mexico, and I think the reason for that is they simply don't sell that much in Mexico. But nonetheless, this is the standard for North America. Now, even though policies and agreements are treated the same in Canada or Mexico, again, policies are still a much better business choice because of the flexibility that goes with them. Okay, another issue is if I'm doing a policy, okay, what are the penalties for policy violations? And I mentioned earlier, this area has evolved so that the penalties look pretty much the same for MAP or MRP. You can have financial penalties. Ones we see most often are the loss of accrued funds and no additional accrual. So the policy may say, look, if you violate the policy and you have accrued promotional funds, either specific to the SKU that you violated on, or all of our products, or our product family, or whatever, you lose whatever's been accrued. And during the penalty period, whatever that is, 30, 60, 90 days, there's no additional accrual. Another one that I particularly like, maybe because I thought of it, and I like to think of myself as being very clever, my wife says I'm not, but is the loss of an implicit discount. And an implicit discount, we say, look, implicit in our price to you, reseller, of X dollars is a 10% discount for advertising and promotion. If you violate MAP or MRP, you lose that implicit discount. So your acquisition price just went up by 10% during the penalty period. Another alternative is the loss of product access for this penalty period. And we've had some clients that say, look, you lose complete access to this product or products, and I'll come to that in a second, during this period, or you only lose a percentage of them. We'll allocate you only 50% of your normal volume, or if you send us an order, we'll only fill half of it or whatever during this 30, 60, 90-day penalty period. The coverage in this regard can be a single SKU where the violation occurred. It can be a product family, and we introduce this concept because sometimes just pulling a SKU may not be enough. So a SKU may just be the purple ones, but the reseller can still buy the green ones, the orange ones, the yellow ones, the blue ones. So we say product family, designed to be as broad as the manufacturer wants to make it in terms of denying coverage. Or we pull everything. We don't sell you anything during this, this particular period. The goal here with penalties is to provide sting. We want to show that we're serious. So therefore we want to do something that's meaningful, but we're not at the point of shooting somebody in the head till they're dead. That doesn't happen yet. Let me put this in a greater context, and that is often when we do these kinds of programs, we do 3 strikes and you're out or 4 strikes and you're out programs. So the first violation is usually we send you a violation notice. We give you a period of time to remedy it. If it can be remedied, it may already have been stopped by the time the notice goes out, but that still means a violation has been accrued. But we give you a period to remedy it. If you remedy it, or nothing happens to you, but if you accrued 1 violation. The second violation could be if you fail to remedy the first within the time period that we mandate. And it's often, for online, it may be 24, 48 hours. If it's in a roto, the roto may have a 7-day life, so we would specify in 7 days you got to stop, and they probably would anyway. So it floats on whatever the medium is that's involved. Any event, if somebody fails to remedy, or they commit a whole new violation, It goes into the second level, and the second level, that's where these things come up, where we may have financial penalties or loss of product access or both. We may combine them if we really want to provide sting. Then in a 3-strike and you're out program, the third strike is what I call the ultimate penalty. And that is, it's an indefinite loss of product access, either to the SKU where the last violation occurred, the product family, or again, everything. Indefinite loss. We like the idea of indefinite loss. It's like a sword hanging over their heads. But the reality is, as many of our clients have said, hey, we're in the business to sell product, not cut people off. Can we turn them back on? And the answer is yes. You can, if you think that somebody's learned their lesson, you can reinstate them by starting to sell them again, subject to the policy, and wipe the slate clean. You can absolutely do that if you want to. And there may be other resellers that you simply don't want to sell again because you know they're going to continue to violate or they're just not worth it. There's no requirement to reinstate them. The law is crystal clear. You can pick and choose who your customers are and who get to sell your products. So a lot of flexibility built in here. But again, the real goal is compliance. You want people to comply. You want them to see that the stakes of non-compliance are high enough that it's going to sting. And when they do violate, whether it be inadvertently or whether it be on purpose or they're testing the waters, they want to see if you really mean it, hitting them with the penalty and being willing to live with it makes a big difference and buys you credibility. We have seen situations where, usually under the pressure I alluded to earlier from resellers, manufacturers will adopt policies and they say, see, I've got a policy, the world's a better place, buys them some credibility for a couple of months, everybody's happy, but they don't enforce it. They don't enforce their policy and pretty soon it just completely falls apart and there's nothing there. So we always tell clients up front, don't put anything in place you're not prepared to enforce with your biggest customer. And we understand the realities, that the profit and loss responsibilities and so on, and the idea of cutting somebody off. I'll give you a real life example. One of our clients that's in the women's apparel area, for which we did an MRP policy, sells primarily to specialty stores and high-end retailers like Saks and Nordstrom and the like. It was also selling to Amazon. So it was selling to Amazon 1P, Amazon was reselling. And I remember talking to the people at the company and saying, well, do you have any issues with Amazon? And they said, no, Amazon's been just fine. They've been upholding the price, not an issue. Then about a year later, I got a call that said, Amazon's violating our policy. And I said, look, either you've got a policy or you don't. If you want to give Amazon a pass, you can, but your policy is going to fall apart pretty quickly. If you are incapable of enforcing it, and we're talking about many millions of dollars of sales here, if you're incapable of enforcing it against Amazon, you know, that's okay. I mean, it is what it is, but then I would just quietly withdraw your policy. Well, they enforced it against Amazon and cut Amazon off. And what happened was the same thing we've seen every time Amazon is cut off, whether it's a big brand or it's a little brand. Within 30 days, Amazon comes back begging to be reinstated, begging. Now, why is that? With big brands, you sort of understand it, but what about little brands? Amazon wants to be all things to all people. And if you cut them off and you show them that you mean it, they really want the product and they're going to come back. So we've never seen a situation where Amazon hasn't come back after being cut off. And they promise to be good. You have to be careful about accepting promises like that, and there are ways to handle it. But nonetheless, our clients who reinstate them usually don't have problems with Amazon later in that kind of scenario. Okay, other policy issues. What's the timing of the policy going to be? When is it effective? There's usually a ramp up period. You usually don't just say tomorrow our policy is effective and we're going to be taking down names of violators. Usually give us some ramp up time. We've had it as long as several months. More typical is 30 days or less. What are your minimum prices? This is really an art form, and I don't care if it's MAP or MRP or a variation. What's your minimum price? If you set it too high, you're going to lose sales. If you set it too low, you're leaving money on the table. So what's that sweet spot? What does that minimum price have to be? What products are covered? Everything that I sell or only some things that I sell? And by the way, we usually do is separate from the policies a list of the covered products. And this means that you can change the list over time, as you would expect. You're going to have some products that should be covered, maybe new products, maybe some older products that don't need to be covered anymore or are discontinued. As you make changes in the marketplace, such as raising your acquisition prices, which of course has been occurring a lot lately with inflation, you're going to change your MAPs or your MRPs accordingly. You're going to bump them up as you raise prices and the like. Something else in the policy is the violation penalties along the lines of what I talked about before. What are you willing to do? 3 strikes and you're out, 4 strikes and you're out. We've got some folks, let's put it this way, I'm familiar with some policies that give 5 or 6 strikes. And at some point you just say, hey, how many bites at the apple do they get before you get really serious? So we tend to encourage 3 strike or 4 strike and you're out policies. Another one that comes up is resetting the clock. So we've got clients who will say, well, or let me give you an example, not a client of ours, but one in the plumbing products area has an Imap policy where they reset the clock every year. Now, if I'm a reseller and I know that all the violations are going to be wiped out at the end of 1 year, or maybe it's 18 months, it's some period like that, a year or 18 months. If I know all my violations are going to be wiped out, what do I do near the end of the measurement period? I violate the hell out of the policy. Why not? Because I know in 2 weeks, all is forgiven. So we don't like resetting the clock. That having been said, the manufacturer always has the ability to reset the clock if they want to and to wipe the slate clean. We don't put it in the policy. But if you feel at some point it's worthwhile to do an amnesty or something like that, you announce it and you do it and you wipe it out. But you don't, as a regular manner, build it into the policy so that people know that given these various time periods, everything is cleaned up. One thing we focus on a lot is cheat proofing, and that is, how can people cheat? And one way to cheat is bundling, for example. So most of our policies cover bundling. We've had some clients say, well, why should I care about bundling as long as my price is upheld? Well, if a reseller builds in free goods, they may be offering your product at the appropriate price, but they're giving away all these free goods. They're essentially providing a discount. So we think really hard about cheat proofing and how to deal with that. By the same token, there may be certain things that are freebies, and an approved freebie, meaning that we're not going to treat it as a discount, as shipping. Why? Because almost everybody offers free shipping. And then there may be some exemptions, or by exemptions, there may be certain behaviors that are exempt provided that certain hoops are jumped through. How do we deal with store-wide, site-wide, or category-wide sales? How do we deal with discounts like Target's Red Card? For those that are familiar with that, if you carry Target's Red Card, which is a credit card, you get a 5% discount at checkout. So you could take the point of view, for example, if you had an MRP policy where you say, no, sorry, Target, you can't give that discount. Well, you're not going to be able to sell Target because they offer it across the board. So you need to build in an exemption for that. Another exemption may be, and we've got clients go both ways on this, when the prices are invisible for some of the warehouse clubs, like you have to be a Costco member and you have to put in your membership number in order to see what the price is. Some of our clients say, hey, we don't care about that because it's essentially invisible to the public. Others say, yeah, we care about it. So you think through these kinds of things. We believe that it makes sense to designate a policy administrator. And a policy administrator is somebody who runs the program, and he or she is the face of the program, answers questions, makes decisions or whatever. It can have a lot of autonomy, or behind this person is a committee that makes the big decisions. But this person is the face. And in fact, I keep saying it's a person, and it could well be, but often this person is anonymous, or you can say it's Mary Smith or Bob Jones or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, but it depends on what works for entities. What you want to do, particularly if you want to maintain unilateral policy status, is not have your salespeople or other managers within the company talking about the policy, deciding what's inbounds and out of bounds or whatever. You want everything to be held by the policy administrator. You want everything to be shot over to the policy administrator. And finally, other restrictions that you may want to include. What we've been including in our pricing policies are distribution restrictions, such as you can't sell it on any websites other than those that we approve in advance, because we want to know where people are selling, or a variation on that theme is you can sell any place you want, but if we tell you you have to get off a website, you have to get off of it. So we include other kinds of considerations. One thing I can't stress enough is to avoid what I call the policy's panacea trap. Some people think that, gee, we put a policy in place and the world suddenly will be a better place. Well, that's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. So you can't overlook business and legal conflicts and friction, both within your organization and without. So for example, within an organization, an area of friction is often with the sales force, particularly if the sales force is compensated based on volume. The last thing they want to do is see somebody get cut off where the volume goes down and their paycheck gets smaller. So you need to make sure you get buy-in on the part of the sales force, usually because senior management says, hey, we're going to do it this way. We got to do it this way. But it is important to integrate a policy, look more broadly, with your overall channel strategy, with your trade spending and sales practices. We've got plenty of clients who the biggest issue in resale price erosion is their trade spending. They reinforce it with the way they put money on the table. And also has to be consistent with your brand protection strategy. From an external point of view, you've got to deal with unauthorized resellers. You can't have a good policy that's successful unless if you have uncontrolled distribution. So you need to add some control at least into who gets your product, because simply there should be some people who shouldn't have it. And this goes, and it's easy enough to talk about selective distribution, which is common with consumer durables. It's harder when you talk about intensive distribution with consumer packaged goods. But even the consumer packaged goods people are recognizing, hey, well, we want our products in a lot of different places. Some people shouldn't have them, including those that are chronic policy violators, those that sell the wrong products in the wrong ways, those that disguise their identities. The bottom line is there are limited remedies in going after these people. And it can be very expensive and time consuming to go chasing them. It's something that Michelle does for a living with great success, but it's also frustrating and very time consuming to do this. The better alternative and the cheaper alternative is controlled distribution up front. It's much cheaper than chasing people after the fact and much better overall. If you don't control, this is what your reseller of the year looks like. And this is very common where we certainly have situations where people who sell the most never inventory the product. They never see the product. It's drop shipped on the part of distributors or whatever. And you wind up with this guy being your reseller of the year. I think you want to avoid that. Okay, additional materials, and I'll wrap this up quickly, to complement the policy would be distributor or reseller agreements or policies that deal with some of these distribution restrictions. You may want your resellers or retailers selling only to end users. You don't want them selling to other resellers. Why? Because if you cut somebody off, that's going to destroy them being cut off because they'll be able to get product elsewhere. You may want to limit your distributors to only selling to authorized end users, or I'm sorry, authorized resellers. We often couple a policy with a cover letter or email that explains what we're doing, or a more detailed explanation that includes FAQs, a memo for internal guidance in terms of how this works. And sometimes that's coupled with a Miranda card. The internal memo or the Miranda card or both say essentially to people internally, look, anybody asks you about our policy, you refer them all to the policy administrator. You don't wind up running your mouth off on what's inbounds and outbounds and things like that. Everything goes to the policy administrator. And then the other thing we provide are violation notices. These are templates because it doesn't make sense to have lawyers sending out these violation notices on an everyday basis. Now, monitoring services such as TrackStreet are willing to send out the notices on your behalf. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's often a very good idea. But we provide the templates that are consistent with the policy. Sometimes we have people sending out notices where they ask for things or say things that aren't in the policy. It makes no sense at all. And in that regard, we have some clients who say, you know, particularly when we're introducing a new policy that hasn't been there before, for a period of time, we're going to provide courtesy violation notices. And what this means is the policy is not effective yet, but we're telling resellers, look, given this behavior at this particular time, and here's a screenshot, this would constitute a violation of our policy. We're not enforcing it yet, but we're letting you know that that would be a violation so you can clean it up before we do go live. And then, of course, there are for real violation notices. Careful implementation is necessary to preserve the unilateral policy nature. You want to avoid any agreement on advertised or resale price. That means no contracts that talk about this. And let me just pause here for a second. I can't tell you how many times I've seen situations where somebody says, this is a unilateral policy. And then they have an agreement that says, hey, reseller, you agree to follow all of our policies. Once you do that, you've now converted your policy into an agreement. So you got to be careful about that. No assurances of compliance. You don't want people calling up and saying, it's about time you did this. Where do I sign up? No sign-ups necessary. No probation. If somebody behind the scenes, if somebody makes a legitimate mistake and you want to convince you that it was a mistake, a typographical error or whatever, and you want to give them a break, fine. As long as you do that uniformly. You don't put in your policy, though, that mistakes don't count, because then everybody would be saying every violation is just a mistake. So you can give people a break behind the scenes as long as you're consistent, but we'd never put that in the policy. There may be some training and guardrails that are necessary for your field people and those at headquarters. And then finally, using the policy administrator is key. We'll open it up to Q&A, but I just wanted to let everybody know that we're going to do a follow-on program of this one where we're going to cover some of these concepts again, because after all, we may have some new people online and there may be a review may be appropriate. But more importantly, we're going to focus specifically on successfully designing and implementing and enforcing the policies, whether it's improving an existing policy or adopting a new one. And as a kicker, since this program is designed not only for business people, that is the one on September 29th at 1 p.m. Central, also sponsored by Track Street. As a kicker to get lawyers involved, since we lawyer types are required to get continuing legal education, it's our intention to secure that in whatever states we need to do so. So more details coming. Thank you. Ready to turn it over.
Thanks, Gene. A lot of great information there. We did have a few questions come in, but the first comment, which was my favorite too, was someone commented that the reseller of the year was their favorite slide, and it was mine too. I think that guy works in his mom's basement, uses his garage as a warehouse. So that was definitely one of my favorites as well. So a couple of questions came in. The first one is, can we change our map price at any time?
Yes. I think the only thing that you have to keep in mind is, and you don't want to change it now and say it's effective in 10 minutes. I mean, you want to give people some notice that's reasonable. We often put into our policies that if we make changes, we will endeavor, and endeavor is a nice lawyerly way of saying we'll try to give you 5 days notice. That's just try. It doesn't mean we have to, but it's a good idea. I mean, you know, you're not trying to set traps to catch people. You're trying to do things that are realistic. So yes, you can change your maps anytime you feel like it, but you should give some notice to allow people to come into compliance.
Perfect. And then the next one was curious what your thoughts are on how you clearly communicate a hybrid map MRP price list to partners.
Well, first, the policy explains that and tries to do it in a very straightforward way. And you can also do an executive summary if you want, since people may not read the whole policy or whatever. That explains how that works. But where the proof is really in the pudding is on your covered products list. You would have, you list a product, and then there might be 2 columns, MRP or MAP. And if it's checked, or if there's a price that's shown, that would tell you which is covered. We haven't had issues about this in the past. Most people understand it. That having been said, there aren't a whole lot of those kinds of policies around. Relatively few of our clients have decided to do that. You know, you could have 2 entirely separate policies, but since a lot of the boilerplate is the same, you can combine it into one. I think you just have to, and this is a point made by the person asking the question, I think you have to clearly communicate what you're doing so you don't have confusion.
Thank you. And then the last one is, how do you enforce against a min-max policy on the max side? What kind of options?
Well, the same way you would do it on the min side. So when Track Street is scraping and looking at screenshots, you would look for violations not only in anybody who went lower than the minimum, but anybody who went above on the maximum. It just adds that. Now, you know, again, there aren't very many people that are concerned about maximum, although we've had more questions about that lately. Because of some people taking advantage of supply chain issues to really goose prices. And the concern is, of course, that consumers will have a long memory, and when the price drops next year or something, they're going to say, hey, you really screwed me by charging me too much. So, there's that. And then there's something else too, I think, which is, let's face it, behind these policies is the notion that in a lot of manufacturers, they have a positioning they want for their product. Good, better, best, designer level prices, whatever. So the certain pricing implications of that. And so the min-max might be a way of making sure that products stay slotted where they're supposed to be. I mean, the last thing you want to do is tell the world that this is a designer product and therefore has this very high price. But essentially in the marketplace, the price really erodes. So it's not $100, it's $23.95. Now you don't have that kind of prestige product anymore.
Sure. Let's see, another comment. Speaking from experience, policies are worthless without enforcement. It is hard in the beginning, but once retailers realize that you are serious, it gets much easier. And I would happen to agree with that. I always tell our clients to remember that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It takes time, but once you're consistent with your policies and your enforcement, your retailers understand that you're serious about it. You start to get much better compliance over time.
Yeah, I agree completely. Michelle, you've heard me talk about this before, but one of our clients is called Advanced Clutch Technology, and it's a company that makes replacement automotive clutches, and it is an MRP policy. These folks are really, really tough. In fact, what they do is they periodically go out and audit. They'll go to distributors, they'll go to dealers, usually those that are being pains, or they otherwise have reason to believe that they may be playing games. And they don't do this with everybody, but they may do it a couple, 3 times a year. They'll hire a local CPA firm and they'll go in and start looking at invoices. If they find a violation, they apply the penalty. Because of that, and because people know that they have the risk of being audited, their compliance rate is like 99.9%, because they really show that they're serious about it. And the other thing is, it goes back a few years, but we did an MRP policy for a company that sells musical instruments. Trombones and trumpets and clarinets and all that sort of stuff. And what they did is they ran a full-page ad in an industry publication, which I think is called Music Merchant. And it said, look, our competitors have MAP policies. We protect you better with an MRP policy because we cover your actual selling price. And they used the fact that they had a policy as a sales tool to get better dealers.
There's some great marketing opportunities with that.
And people tend not to think about that, but that is an advantage. If you're telling retailers or other resellers that you're locking a margin in, and it's a healthy margin, that's going to help you a lot. But going with that means you have to enforce it too. You can't just say that on paper.
Right. Well, we are out of time for today. Gene, thank you so much for sharing all of your wonderful knowledge with everyone today. And we look forward to another round in September. And check back on our LinkedIn for more information on that upcoming webinar.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.